The Bible has long been accused of containing mistakes, errors, and contradictions. In some cases, these were the result of printers. For example, we've got the Wicked Bible, which at Exodus 20:14 says, "Thou shalt commit adultery." The Party Bible says, "Sin on more," in Jeremiah 31:34. The Wife Beater Bible says, "And if she be not obedient and helpful unto him, endeavoreth to beat the fear of God into her," 1 Peter 3:7. And the Printer's Bible, which ironically says, "Printers have persecuted me without a cause," Psalm 119:161. Well, that's pretty accurate, seeing as how there were about 2 or 3 dozen different types of Bibles who had these sorts of mistakes in them. Well, these mistakes are humorous to us today, although probably not for the printers who produced them. They were heavily fined and could be put out of business for making a simple typographical error like this. But what about other mistakes? Other errors that were the result not of a printer, but that were something that were in the original text itself. Specifically, we're going to talk about contradictions in the Bible, or rather, alleged contradictions. Finding a legitimate contradiction is one of the holy grails of biblical criticism. If critics can prove that the Bible clearly and indisputably contradicts itself, then they've gone a long way to proving that the Bible is not the Word of God. The Bible clearly states that it comes from God, is inspired by Him, and is therefore demonstrably true. But if there's a contradiction, then we've got a problem. In the Encyclopedia of Biblical Errancy, Dennis McKenzie writes, "Contradictions remain the most obvious, the most potent, the most easily proven, and the most common problem to plague the book." In his book, Losing Faith in Faith, famed atheist Dan Barker says, "People who are free of theological bias notice that the Bible contains hundreds of discrepancies. The Bible is a flawed book." Well, there are places we could go online to find repositories of supposed biblical contradictions. You can go to the Skeptic's Annotated Bible, websites for the American Atheists, or Rational Wiki, and hundreds of other websites and blogs. Some have been published in books like William Burr's Self-Contradictions of the Bible, which was given a ringing endorsement by militant atheist Sam Harris in his book, The End of Faith. And although all these writers have different voices, the one thing they all share in common is the same level of biblical literacy you would expect from the average 4th grader. Well, biblical contradictions are usually created by people who know next to nothing about the Bible, who know even less about the world in which it was written, and who wouldn't be able to interpret the Bible properly if the fate of the human race depended upon it. Identifying alleged contradictions does one thing and one thing only. It confirms what those who question the Bible already want to believe. If biblical ignorance and confirmation bias had a baby, it would look like most of these so-called contradictions. So, let's look at some specific examples of what counts as a biblical contradiction. One of the biggest problems for critics is the failure to pay attention to context. We can see this in the comparison between the law in Deuteronomy 12 and Jesus' commands in Matthew chapter 26. In Deuteronomy 12:16, God forbids the Israelites to eat blood. He says, "Only you shall not eat the blood. You shall pour it out on the earth like water." But at the Last Supper, in Matthew 26, Jesus tells the disciples to drink his blood. He says, "Drink of it, all of you, for this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." So, what's going on here? Is this a biblical contradiction? Well, the first prohibition is against the consumption of animal blood, and at times this played a role in pagan rituals, so it was forbidden under the Mosaic law. But when Jesus tells his disciples to drink the fruit of the vine, it represents his blood in the same way that the bread represents his body. So Jesus is not actually talking about drinking real blood. This is a symbolic action. So there's no contradiction here. Now, in some cases, you'll see critics missing the fact that biblical writers sometimes used figures of speech, like exaggeration, satire, or sarcasm. In Luke 14:26, Jesus says, "If anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, and even his own life, he cannot be my disciple." But Jesus said earlier that God commanded, honor your father and your mother in Matthew chapter 15 and verse 4. So how do we reconcile these two passages? Do you honor your parents or do you hate them? Simply put, Jesus is using a figure of speech. The Greek word miseo, which is literally translated as hate, is often used in a comparative sense. Here, it means to love less. This is a well-known Semitic idiom that sounds pretty odd to Western ears, but it does appear in the Bible almost a dozen times in this sense. Jesus isn't telling anyone to literally hate their parents, but rather to make sure that they love Him more than they do their immediate family. God is our first priority. So again, no contradiction. Finally, there's one other type of contradiction that really reveals the incompetence of many critics. This occurs in cases where translations don't quite capture the original meaning of the text. So, for instance, in Leviticus chapter 11, there is a list of animals that must not be eaten because they are unclean. In verses 13 to 19, it identifies a list of creatures as birds. It says, "And these you shall detest among the birds, for they shall not be eaten, they are detestable." The list then goes on to identify a number of different birds, but at the end, it includes the bat. So, critics love to point out that the Bible here says the bat is a bird. But that's not what it says. The Hebrew term translated as birds more accurately means flying creature. Because the word is used to describe not only birds and bats, but also locusts and grasshoppers, we can see the English translation isn't great, and it has led to some confusion. But a knowledgeable person should be willing and able to investigate these kinds of things so that he doesn't make himself look foolish. Well, people love to point out that the Bible has mistakes and errors and contradictions. If you Google the phrase, "How many errors does the Bible have?" you'll probably get a number somewhere in the tens of thousands. But once you start investigating them, what you'll find is that these problems typically are a product of biblical ignorance combined with anti-religious zeal. So, as far as that goes, I suppose we should be thankful that critics make our jobs easier as Christian apologists.